Years ago, I heard a theologian tell a funny story about his daughter, a girl who I guess was about 8 or 9 years old at the time. She took him aside, called him aside, and whispered, "Don't tell Mommy. Don't tell Mommy, but I wrote a sexist story." Now, let me be clear. I want to make sure you hear what I said. A sexist story, not a sex-y story. It may have been the other, but she didn't confess that part. Now, you might wonder why in the world she wanted to keep this a secret from Mommy. I mean, what's wrong with a story about a princess? You might ask that unless you happen to know who Mommy is. Mommy turns out to be Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, a New Testament scholar, world famous as a feminist interpreter of Scripture. And her daughter, I suspect, knew very well how her mother might feel about those stereotyped gender roles and all those old fairy tales about princes and princesses and lords and ladies and all of that kind of stuff. But the sexism in those stories isn't the only issue, because that's part of a whole patriarchal worldview that in medieval times became known as the Great Chain of Being, in which all the beings at the top of the chain were more intellectual, more spiritual than those along the bottom, and more rational. At the top, of course, is God, who is pure spirit. Then come the angels, then human beings, then animals, plants, and finally minerals. And that might sound like a good idea, like an accurate description of the way things are, until you realize some things about it. It, for example, has been used to support the divine right of kings. And it set men above women, claiming that men are more spiritual, more rational, more intellectual than women. Boo. And that has been used to set one race above another, to support slavery, and that sometimes it encourages us to see the lower parts of the world, nature, spiritless, mere matter, as something to be exploited rather than cared for. I think Mommy might have given that little girl a lecture about all this if Daddy betrayed her. I don't know whether he did or not. I wonder also what Mommy, who is a Roman Catholic, thinks about the Christian celebration that Pope Pius XI instituted in 1925 as the feast of our Lord Jesus Christ, the King. We're celebrating that today. But at the risk of being a spoilsport, let me ask some questions. Do we really want to think about Christ as King? After all, we Americans broke with that crazy old King George, didn't we? We broke with monarchy, and we didn't make our George a king. When we use royal language about God or Christ, are we unconsciously reverting to that hierarchical understanding of reality, of authority? And when we think about Christ as King of Kings, are we unwittingly legitimating autocratic governments on the earthly level? Are we buying into that great chain of being again? Well, there's another way of thinking about this. When the early Christians spread the gospel in the Roman world, they used a patriarchal title. They spoke of Christ as Kyrios, Lord. But there was someone else in that world who was also called Kyrios. Do you know? It was Caesar, who was worshipped as divine in the cult of the emperor. So when Paul and others proclaimed that Christ is Kyrios, the implication is pretty clear, is it not? If Christ is Lord, then Caesar is not. So the Christian gospel in its earliest days was subversive of arbitrary and oppressive power. The gospel was also subversive of that whole patriarchal worldview. It was Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, by the way, who first noticed the implications of that very strange, puzzling, and disturbing injunction of Jesus, call no man on earth your father. You have one Father, the Father in heaven. Now, that's not a rejection of fathers, but it is a rejection of a patriarchal system that made the male in the household the Lord and Master, the absolute authority. When Jesus stands before Pilate in the Gospel of John, Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" What he's really asking, of course, is whether Jesus is a revolutionary trying to throw off the yoke of Rome. So this is how Jesus answers. My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. In other words, am I trying to dethrone Caesar? Good grief, I don't have an army. Am I a king? Well, I have a kingdom, but not one that gets its power from the power structures of this world. The authority I exercise comes from above. It comes from God. Now, some people want to interpret this passage in a way that completely distorts it. Since Jesus isn't trying to overthrow Rome, he must approve of Rome. He must be okay with an empire that's enslaved half the world. He must accept that standard wisdom that God institutes the governments of the world. A view we can find in parts of the Bible, even in Paul. But that's not the point at all. The point is that because Jesus speaks and acts on the authority of God, his kingdom, or better, his rule or reign in the world, takes precedence over any other kingdom or rule. It takes precedence over any source of authority that is rooted in worldly power. But just because his kingdom is not rooted in earthly power, it's a very different kind of kingdom or reign or rule. Remember what's going on in this scene. Jesus is about to be sent to his death. So the power he exercises is the exact opposite of the power of the absolute monarch. It is not the power of force, of coercion. It's not power backed up by military might. It is the persuasive power of love. It's the power of self-sacrificing, self-giving love, which is backed up only by the appeal to the human heart that love and love alone can make. So Jesus' kingdom is not a political kingdom rooted in the arbitrary power wielded by kings and dictators, but it does have political implications. If Christ is Lord, then no earthly government can claim that status. No earthly power can claim our ultimate loyalty. Now, we can, of course, as Christians, have provisional loyalties to earthly institutions, to governments, to families, to organizations, as long, that is, as they act in accordance with the ideals of Christ's reign. Some of us in the South, in the days of the Civil Rights Movement, had a hard lesson to learn about that, as the whole white power structure, and sometimes our own families, taught us to live under the lordship of an oppressive system known as segregation. We had to learn, sometimes at great cost, that if Christ is Lord, then governors and legislatures and sheriffs are not. And families are not. and churches that comply with a racist system are not. And boy, there were a lot of those in those days. So I think of this Sunday, Christ the King Sunday, not as an endorsement of royal power, but as a subversion of it. It's a declaration that our ultimate loyalty belongs only to God, not to Caesar, not to any human government, not to any nation, not to any political ideology or political party, or any economic system. We can have provisional loyalties to any of these, but all, without exception, have to be evaluated in light of the gospel and embraced only to the extent that they embrace those values. And if that's so, then Jesus' reign actually challenges the biblical notion that God is the one who institutes human governments. When Pope Pius XI instituted the Feast of Christ the King, dictators were in power in many nations, and some Christians, let's say it, many Christians were attracted to them. Part of his motive was to assert Christ's supremacy over any human government. So to name Christ as king is to say that no person or government on earth should have that kind of power. When members of the Methodist student movement in 1959 sat in University Methodist Church in Baton Rouge, we were breaking a law passed by the Louisiana legislature that prohibited white and black people from meeting together. And we did that in perfectly good conscience because Jesus Christ, not that legislature, reigned in our hearts. Should we think of Christ, the Jesus who commands no army, as a king? The issue has to do, I think, with how we think about authority. For many years, I assigned a reading in one of my classes by the psychotherapist Viktor Frankl. It was a chapter from his book originally titled From Death Camp to Existentialism, later reissued as Man's Search for Meaning. Anybody know it? Oh, good. In it, Frankl recounted his experiences as a survivor of a Nazi concentration camp and ended with this observation. The people who survived that camp, psychologically, were those who had some sense of purpose in their lives. I think most of the students, I'd like to think that most of the students found this a powerful insight. But one year, one of my very best students said she didn't like it. She didn't like it at all. Her reason was that she thought that Frankl looked to something outside of himself for a sense of purpose, and she thought that should come from within. Well, what do you think? I understood what she meant, but I thought she let herself get hung up on a false dilemma. I wish I had thought to tell her what the theologian Paul Tillich has to say about this kind of issue. Tillich writes about three ways of understanding authority. One of these he calls heteronomy. Heteros is Greek for other. Nomos means law. Heteronomous authority. Heteronomy is authority from outside ourselves. It's the authority of a king or a parent or an expert. The opposite is autonomy. Autos means self. Autonomy is authority from within. Autonomous people are their own authorities, a law unto themselves. Well, heteronomy is oppressive. It stifles our ability to choose for ourselves. It imposes values on us rather than convinces us of them. But autonomy is no better. It's essentially lawless. Permission to do whatever pleases us. Remember what Jesus says can come from within us? Theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, stuff like that. And we can add to that list racism and sexism and anti-Semitism and any other of many forms of bigotry that are spreading throughout the world today, and unfortunately, in our own country. But heteronomy and autonomy are not our only choices. Tillich's third option he called theonomy. Theos is Greek for God. Theonomy is God as authority. But this is very important. This is very important. This is very important. Tillich didn't mean God as a purely external authority. He meant God as the voice from without that touches the best that all is already in us. It's the authority that unites the internal and the external. The authority that persuades us rather than coerces us. It doesn't impose values on us, it convinces us of values. It's the paradoxical power of the cross, not of the sword. So once again, should we speak of Christ as King? It depends on whether we're thinking of his authority in terms of heteronomy or theonomy. But I believe that more important than the title we give this Sunday is our conviction that the only power that is capable of convincing us of values, of transforming us spiritually, is that persuasive power of self-giving love. That's the kind of love we find in the Jesus who says that his reign is not from this world and who stands ready to give his life. And that's the only kind of power, that's worthy of worship. The paradoxical power of the crucified Christ. Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza suggests that we translate the New Testament word basileia, not as kingdom, as we usually do, but as commonwealth. So I want to close with a prayer in that spirit. O God, may thy kingdom come, though not as domination by a king, but rather as your kingdom, your commonwealth, a fellowship of equals in your sight who strive together that this might come to pass. Thy will be done on earth. For when that happens, Christ will truly rule in human hearts. Amen.